All right, so today we're diving into a story that's both deeply personal and honestly pretty harrowing. We're talking about Mrs. Escobar, My Life with Pablo, the memoir by Victoria Eugenia Henao, who, as you probably know, was Pablo Escobar's wife.
Yeah, and the sources you've dug up give us this incredibly intimate look into her life alongside, well, one of the most notorious figures of the 20th century.
For sure. So, what we're aiming for in this deep dive is to unpack her experiences, to try to understand the human cost of all that, and some of those, frankly, unbelievable details that come up throughout the story.
I think one of the most fascinating things right off the bat is the timing of this memoir. Victoria Eugenia Henao wrote this a full 25 years after Pablo Escobar's death.
Right. This wasn't some quick reaction to everything that happened. It seems like a lot of thought went into it.
Absolutely. And one of the things she really wanted to do, and this was closely tied to her son's efforts to come to terms with their family history, was to make sure that what they went through wouldn't happen to others.
Yeah. Juan Pablo, her son, has been pretty public about coming to terms with his father's actions. And it seems like his own journey really pushed her to finally share her side of the story.
For sure. And the way she describes the book is pretty telling. She calls it a one-way journey into the darkest depths of his soul and of my life.
Wow. That's pretty intense.
Yeah, and you can really sense that she's carrying a lot of weight. She even talks about wanting to ask for forgiveness,
Mm.
not just for what Pablo did, but also for the things she feels she may have failed to do.
Right. Okay, so let's talk about what life was actually like for Victoria living under Pablo's control. The book really gives you this feeling of being trapped.
Yeah, absolutely. She talks about how unsure she was about what the future held for her and her children without Pablo.
And then there's this constant fear. It's almost like she was afraid that he, the most dangerous man in Colombia, might turn on her if she tried to leave.
Right, and the timeline of everything that happened just adds to the sense of terror. The assassination of the Minister of Justice in 1984, which Pablo ordered, was a major turning point.
Yeah.
From that point on, for 9 years, she lived in a state of, well, absolute terror. And what really strikes you is that Pablo didn't seem to understand, or maybe he just didn't care, about how his actions were affecting his own family.
It's chilling to read about how that fear was present even in their private moments. She talks about waking up in the middle of the night, convinced that she was about to see a rifle pointed at her face.
Yeah, that wasn't just some abstract fear. She had actually experienced that multiple times.
It's hard to imagine the psychological impact of living like that.
It really shows how deeply the violence had penetrated their lives. But even in this environment of constant fear and chaos, there are these moments where they try to have some kind of normal family life.
Right? It's a crazy contrast.
Exactly.
Like they made an effort to homeschool their kids, Manuela and Juan Pablo, because it was just too dangerous to send them out into the world.
And think about what Manuela was studying.
Yeah.
English, Spanish, math, civics, theater, singing, general humanities. She had 6 different tutors.
Well,
It's almost this really poignant image of them trying to give their daughter an education in the middle of all this madness.
it is. And then you have these little details that are kind of bizarre considering what was going on around them.
Like what?
Well, Pablo had this thing where he'd spend 2 hours bathing and brushing his teeth. He did it even during the most stressful times.
It's such a weird detail, right?
Yeah.
This guy is like orchestrating all this chaos, but he's super focused on personal hygiene.
Right. It almost makes you think he was trying to create some order for himself in this life that was completely out of control.
That's an interesting point.
And there's this really touching memory she shares about looking at this cobalt blue star with Pablo and Manuela at the Blue House, which was their last hideout.
Yeah.
It's really sweet that Manuela still looks for that star today. It's like her way of connecting with her father.
That's a great example of those little moments of humanity that shine through in this really dark story. It's a reminder that even someone like Pablo Escobar had other sides to him.
Yeah. He also seems to have had this deep sense of loneliness, like he didn't have anyone he could truly trust.
Which is kind of ironic for a guy who had so much power.
Mm.
Okay, so let's talk more about that Blue House. Life there sounds like it was dominated by this constant sense of threat.
Yeah. She makes it clear that it was absolutely crucial to stick to a strict schedule for Pablo. Any change, any delay was a sign of danger.
It's pretty amazing how they even managed to communicate. He was getting something like 50 letters a day delivered through this network of messengers.
That must have made it almost impossible to track.
Yeah, it speaks to how sophisticated his whole operation was, even when he was in hiding.
So the security around the Blue House itself sounds pretty intense. 2 gates, remote control access.
Right. But then you have this weird detail about Pablo wanting to make the place feel spotless and homely.
Yeah, he hired some random guy to paint it his favorite color, light blue, and he even stayed there while the work was being done, which probably wasn't the smartest move security-wise.
It's like he was so desperate for some sense of normalcy, even if it meant putting himself at risk.
It's a real contradiction. And his love of light blue wasn't just about the house. He was also really into the light blues in that Francisco Antonio Cano painting, La Marina, that Victoria had bought.
Right, these little preferences give us a glimpse into a side of him that was totally separate from the whole drug lord persona.
And there's this really interesting story about Pablo reading from a book that had this dedication in it. For my little donkey, Victoria, who can't remember anything but me.
Wow, that's pretty intense.
Yeah, it really gets at the complex relationship they had, this mix of affection, dependence, and control.
It does. And that brings us to their eventual separation. And it's actually kind of surprising that it was Pablo who first suggested hiding out in the jungle.
Which, I mean, sounds terrifying. But in the end, it was Victoria who decided to leave. She wanted to protect her kids, even though it meant leaving the man she'd loved since she was 15.
That must have been an unbelievably hard decision.
And his last words to her, his promise that he'd find her, are just heartbreaking. They agreed to tell Manuela that they were going on a trip without her dad.
Yeah.
And the image of them leaving in that Chevrolet Sprint, with Pablo and Angelito following them until they reached the Altos building, is just so vivid. His last honks of the horn, her final glimpse of him, just 75 days before his death. It's a really powerful moment.
Yeah, it really is. And even after they separated, life wasn't exactly safe for Victoria and the kids. In the Altos building, they were still living under constant threat.
There was even a rifle grenade attack on the building. It landed right above their apartment.
Wow.
Yeah.
Luckily, it didn't explode.
But the CTI agents, the ones who were protecting them, had even come up with all these plans for what to do if they were attacked. That's how dangerous things were.
And Victoria was pretty sure that the government wasn't actually interested in capturing Pablo alive. They just wanted him dead.
Right. And then Angelito, Pablo's last bodyguard, was killed.
Yeah, which was a huge blow. He was their only link to Pablo's inner circle.
And then there were these disappearances, right?
Right. Nariz, Alicia, Albalia, Manuela, and Juan Pablo's teacher, and Nubia. These weren't just people moving away. It was pretty clear that something bad had happened to them.
Yeah. And it says a lot about Victoria that she took in Albalia's kids after she disappeared.
It does. The situation in the Altos building was getting pretty desperate. At one point, they had 6 people crammed into a dressing room, and Juan Pablo was even carrying a shotgun.
Wow. That's a lot for a kid to deal with.
It is. Those nights in November 1993, she says, were the worst of her life. And the Attorney General's office was basically saying that Pablo had to surrender before they'd help the family leave the country. It was a no-win situation.
It sounds like their attempts to get out of Colombia were incredibly dangerous. The first time they tried, they had undercover police officers on the flight with them.
I can't even imagine the tension on that plane.
And then they were denied entry into Germany and sent back to Colombia.
Which was a huge setback. It turns out that General Oscar Naranjo had actually suggested that Germany deny them entry. It was all part of a plan to track down Pablo. They even bugged their apartment and phone lines.
So landing back in Bogota after that must have been devastating. She talks about being completely overwhelmed with anguish.
Yeah, it must have felt like all hope was lost.
Okay, so what about the news of Pablo's death?
It was obviously a moment of shock and disbelief for everyone.
Yeah.
Juan Pablo didn't believe it at first. He was like, that's impossible. And Victoria was frantically trying to confirm it. And then you have this really sad detail about Manuela singing in the shower, totally unaware of what was happening.
It's a stark contrast, her innocence against the backdrop of all this tragedy.
Right. And after Pablo's death, Victoria was desperate for help. She even reached out to Fidel Castro.
Really?
Yeah. She reminded him of their previous, surprisingly friendly encounters and begged him to spare her and her kids. She emphasized how much she had tried to get Pablo to turn away from violence.
So what did Castro say?
He sent her this 3-paragraph response that was kind of vague. He didn't really promise anything specific, but he did seem to offer some reassurance.
Okay, so they were still in Colombia at this point. What happened next?
Well, they actually met with Castro later at Residencias Tequendama, and the main thing they talked about was art.
Art.
Yeah, it was kind of strange. Castro wanted to know what she thought about her collection, and notably, Pablo wasn't there for this meeting.
Interesting.
Yeah. Castro said he wouldn't hurt them, but You could tell that Victoria wasn't entirely convinced.
Right. So was Castro any help to them?
Not really.
Yeah.
And after Pablo's death, they were basically all alone. Their family started fleeing the country because of the threats from Los Pepes. And trying to get refuge in Cuba didn't work out either. They even went to dozens of embassies in Bogota trying to get visas, but nothing came through.
So it sounds like they were trapped.
They were. And on top of all that, they had to deal with Pablo's enemies, who were still out there.
Right. Pablo's men who were in prison started sending messages demanding huge amounts of money. And then there was that attempt on Roberto Escobar's life.
Yeah, and even Pablo's own family seemed to be more interested in money than in helping Victoria and her kids.
That's awful.
Yeah. There's this really chilling scene where she meets with Urdinola from the Cartel del Valle. He calls Pablo a monster, but also hints that they might be able to work something out.
Wow. So they're considering making a deal with their former enemies.
It looks like they didn't have much choice. They were basically broke and had no idea how much property Pablo had actually owned.
So what happened next?
Victoria spent weeks having these horrible conversations with prisoners who were trying to get money out of her. And then her mother-in-law, get this, demanded that she pay off Pablo's debts.
You've got to be kidding me. Her own family was turning against her.
It sounds that way. And then things get even more intense with the Cali cartel.
Yeah, that's the rival cartel, right?
Right. So first, her brother-in-law, Alfredo, has this secret meeting with Miguel and Gilberto Rodriguez Orejuela, who were the leaders of the Cali cartel.
Okay.
But even though they tried to keep it quiet, the Cali cartel knew they were coming.
Wow.
Yeah. And then Victoria and Alfredo are forced into this 4-hour meeting with all these powerful figures, the Cali cartel leaders, members of these paramilitary groups, and representatives of the families of people Pablo had killed.
That must have been terrifying.
It was. They even had armed guards, sicarios all around them.
Oh, man.
Yeah. Miguel Rodriguez basically launched into this attack on Pablo, calling him all sorts of names and demanding over $10 million to cover the cost of their war.
Gee.
And then all these other capos started throwing accusations at Victoria and asking her these really personal, painful questions.
What kinds of questions?
One of them was like, what would Pablo do to our wives if he had the chance? It was clear that they were still incredibly angry about everything that had happened.
It sounds like they were lucky to get out of that meeting alive.
They were. At one point, someone even mentioned that they had planned to dismember Victoria and Manuela and send the pieces to Pablo.
Oh, my God. That's just horrific.
It is. But Gilberto Rodriguez, one of the Cali leaders, seemed a little more interested in making a deal. He was focused on Victoria's children and wanted her to promise that there wouldn't be any more violence.
Okay. So what happened next?
Well, things were really complicated. Victoria had to try to figure out what properties Pablo had actually owned so she could use them to pay off his debts.
Right.
She got some help from a lawyer named Francisco Fernandez, but it was like putting together a giant jigsaw puzzle. And this guy, De Grief, warned her that the Cali cartel might come after her if she didn't pay up.
So what did she do?
She had to get information from Pablo's men who were in prison, and then she had to create all these spreadsheets to bring to her next meeting with the Cali cartel. It was this crazy, stressful process.
It's hard to believe what she went through.
Yeah, and the second meeting with the Cali cartel was just as bad as the first. There were insults and threats flying everywhere.
Wow.
But then there's this really weird twist. One of the guys, Carlos, offers to return a Dali painting that was worth over $3 million.
What? Why would he do that?
It's not entirely clear. But Victoria remembers that Pablo had told her to give half of their remaining money to their enemies if he died. So she was torn about what to do.
That's a really tough decision.
It is. And then she had this terrifying meeting with Carlos Castaño, one of the leaders of Los Pepes.
That was the vigilante group, right? The one that was targeting Pablo and his associates.
Right. So they meet in this remote location, and Castaño basically tells her that she has to pay a price for peace.
Jeez.
Yeah. And she couldn't give him any information about the people who had disappeared, which made things even worse.
Yeah.
She was so scared that she almost passed out.
That's awful. So what happened in the end?
Well, they managed to negotiate a few things.
Yeah.
They gave one of Pablo's planes to someone he owed money to, along with $300,000 in parts. And then Miguel Rodriguez, one of the Cali cartel leaders, told Victoria that Pablo's own siblings had asked them to get involved in collecting his debts.
Wow. Even his own family was against him.
It seems that way. The Cali cartel then arranged a meeting between Victoria and Pablo's mother and sister. It was basically to show them that they had no control over what Victoria was doing.
Right.
But the strange thing is that Miguel Rodriguez actually started acting more friendly toward Victoria and her kids. He even offered to help them out.
Really?
Yeah. And then there's this guy named Ismael who shows up, and he's also demanding assets from Pablo. Victoria gives him what he wants because she knows he's dangerous.
And I guess that's it, right? The end of the story?
Well, not quite. The book also goes back to the beginning of the relationship. It talks about how they met and how their families felt about it.
Oh, yeah, let's hear about that. So how did they meet?
Well, at first, it was this classic forbidden love kind of thing. Victoria was really young and Pablo was much older, and her family was totally against it. They tried to stop her from seeing him, but he kept pursuing her. He even gave her a bicycle as a gift.
That's kind of sweet.
Yeah, and Victoria was head over heels for him. She even told her mom that she was willing to spend her whole life taking meals to him in prison, even though she didn't really know what he was involved in at that point.
Wow. She was really committed.
She was.
Yeah.
And Pablo was kind of dismissive of her attempts to understand his world. He would say things like, "Don't ask Kata, you don't know anything about all that."
Yeah. But in the end, she did find out, right?
She did. So they ended up eloping and getting married in Pasto. Her family was really upset about it.
I bet.
Yeah, but they eventually came around. And those early days of their marriage were actually pretty happy, even though her mother didn't approve of Pablo.
So when did things start to change?
Well, there were some early signs that things weren't quite right. Like Pablo would buy all this expensive furniture, but they didn't even have a refrigerator.
Interesting.
Yeah. And then Pablo started cheating on her. He had a pretty well-known relationship with this woman named Noemi.
Oh, wow. So what did Victoria do?
She eventually forgave him, and then he got arrested,
Hmm?
and she visited him in prison while she was pregnant with Juan Pablo.
That's incredible. I mean, I guess she was still young at that point.
Yeah, she was. And after Juan Pablo was born, they moved into their first house. Pablo was actually really attentive during her pregnancy, and he appreciated her loyalty while he was in prison.
Okay. So was this when his criminal empire really started to take off?
It was around that time they moved into this new house,
Mhm.
and Pablo's office basically became a meeting place for all sorts of shady characters.
Right. So let's talk about Pablo's rise to power. He bought Hacienda Naples and started getting involved in politics.
Yeah, and Victoria didn't really understand where all this money was coming from at first. It wasn't something she was paying much attention to.
Right. So what was life like at Hacienda Naples?
Well, it was pretty wild. They had this huge estate with a private zoo and even Bonnie and Clyde's car.
Bonnie and Clyde's car?
Yeah.
What? How did he get that?
Yeah, it's a pretty crazy story. And Victoria even had a scary encounter with some guerrilla soldiers on the way to Naples one time. The whole place was just this constant whirlwind of activity. Planes were always landing and taking off. It was like a different world.
And then there was the bombing of the Monaco building in 1988.
Right. That was a turning point. It really brought the violence home for Victoria. A lot of her art collection was damaged in the bombing.
It's amazing that she was even able to build an art collection with everything else that was going on.
It was really important to her. It was her way of dealing with the stress and Pablo's constant absences. She became this serious art collector working with dealers and artists, and she even organized a big art auction to help the poor in Medellin.
It sounds like she had a real passion for it.
She did. She was really proud of her collection, which was considered one of the best in Latin America.
But a lot of it was destroyed in the war, right?
Unfortunately, yeah. Los Pepes even burned down her sister's house, where some of her most valuable pieces were being stored. It just shows how far-reaching the violence was.
It's incredible that she was able to hold on to anything at all.
Yeah. Okay, so going back to Pablo, his political ambitions were starting to get bigger, and things were getting even more dangerous.
Right. He got elected to the council in Envigado and was focusing on building athletic facilities.
Yeah, but then he set his sights on national politics, and his whole stance on extradition was getting really heated.
And then there was that scandal with Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, which made things even worse.
Right. That was a major turning point.
Yeah.
And on top of all that, Victoria was pregnant with Manuela.
So things were really intense for her on a personal level as well.
They were. And then, after the Minister of Justice was assassinated, they had to flee to Panama.
Wow. So they were constantly on the run.
Yeah, life was pretty tough for them in Panama. And then Manuela was born there, but Victoria had to be separated from her for a while because of the dangerous situation.
That's awful.
It was. And when they finally got back to Colombia, Manuela didn't even recognize her own mother.
Oh, wow. That's heartbreaking.
It is. And then they went into hiding again, first in Nicaragua and then in a bunch of other places.
It sounds like they were never really safe.
They weren't.
Right.
And then Pablo's father was kidnapped, which must have been terrifying for everyone.
Yeah, I can't imagine what they were going through.
Yeah.
So, what about the other major events that happened during this period, like the assassination of Rodrigo Lara Bonilla?
Well, the book tells that story from the perspective of his son, Jorge Lara. It's a really powerful account. And then there was the whole thing with the M19 guerrilla group.
Right. They took Victoria and Pablo's siblings hostage.
Yeah. And Pablo was involved with the M19 in some pretty complex ways. They even tried to kidnap him at one point.
That's crazy. It sounds like he was making enemies everywhere he went.
He was. And then there was the Barry Seal incident.
Oh, yeah. That was the American pilot who was working for the Medellin cartel and then became an informant for the DEA.
Right. Pablo ordered his execution. And they were living in the Monaco building at this point,
Yeah.
which was constantly under threat.
That's the building that was eventually bombed, right?
Yeah. And then the police colonel, Jaime Ramirez, was murdered,
Mm-hmm.
and the extraditables were formed. That was the group that Pablo was part of, the one that was responsible for a lot of the violence.
Right.
And Victoria and her kids were constantly being harassed by the police. They were stopped at roadblocks. Their properties were raided. It was just nonstop.
And then, of course, the bombing of the Monaco building in 1988.
Yeah, that was a major escalation. And then the military started going after Pablo and his family in a big way. Victoria's brother, Mario, was even killed.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and then Gonzalo Rodriguez, El Mexicano, was killed too. Things were really spinning out of control.
It's amazing that they were able to survive all of that.
It is. And they sent their son, Juan Pablo, to Argentina for safety.
That makes sense. It probably wasn't safe for him to be in Colombia anymore.
It wasn't. And then there was the kidnapping of Diana Turbay and those other journalists. Pablo's men took them hostage to try to pressure the government.
Right.
And then they attacked the Cali cartel, which was a huge gamble. And then the Constitution was changed to ban extradition, which was a big win for Pablo, at least for a while.
So did that calm things down at all?
Not really. Pablo ended up surrendering, but he got to stay in this luxurious prison that he basically built himself called La Catedral.
Right.
But then he escaped from La Catedral, which kicked off this huge manhunt by the search block.
So where was Victoria during all this?
Well, she and the kids were separated from Pablo in those final months before his death.
So what happened to them after he died?
Well, the search block went after them too. They were constantly trying to flee the country, but it was really difficult.
Right. They weren't exactly welcome anywhere.
Exactly. They ended up having to change their identities and eventually settled in Argentina.
So even after Pablo's death, their struggles continued.
They did. They faced legal battles. They were constantly looking over their shoulders. Pablo's past was always there. And, looking back, Victoria realizes that she was basically living in an abusive relationship.
That's a powerful realization.
It is. She talks about how isolation and fear can really distort your understanding of what's happening around you.
Right. So it's an incredibly sad and powerful story.
Yeah.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I think what's really striking about Victoria Eugenia Hanao's story is her resilience, her unwavering dedication to protecting her children, and how deeply Pablo Escobar's actions impacted their lives even decades after his death. It's a story that really makes you think about the lasting consequences of violence.
It does.
And here's something for you all to consider. When you're dealing with extreme situations, how do you balance family loyalty with the need to survive? Victoria's story really makes you think about the human cost of violence and the challenges of seeking forgiveness and rebuilding your life after trauma. And it raises this really tough question. How much responsibility does a family have for the actions of one of its members? It's a lot to ponder. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.